really good and relentless amount of fan voting is hugely important. It doesn't guarantee things. You know, it's been good every time, but I really feel that some of the guys that we're seeing year after year on these cruises, they started to really, it's in the last 5 years that we've had 4 nominations, even though we've been eligible since 1986. And I really think that people like you guys have built such a fantastic relationship and fan base for us. And it means that when all the other artists that have previously been inducted and all the heavyweights in the industry, before they make their vote, they do check in on the fan vote, and it is important. And I know that it took us 4 nominations to get in, and I must say we did get to the point where we were thinking, well, it's just a real honour to be nominated. We honestly did feel that, but we thought, in the end, we can't imagine getting past the winning post. And then we had that phone call saying that we were in, and so thank you again to all you guys. It's very important.
How was it? How did each of you find out? Was it a manager called, and did you then all call each other? Or were you all together when you got the phone call?
I was actually, I live in Spain myself, and I was in my local place to have a drink, if you know what I mean, with my dear wife who's out there somewhere, bless her heart, and got a phone call to Tracy, my wife, and she said, hang on, it's New York, it's New York. She said, I've got to make you put your phone on and answer the phone when it rings. And she didn't say why. So the phone rang and I answered it, and it was our dear lovely Cindy, and she said, you've been nominated, but don't tell anybody. Well, that was it. Gosh, fell apart completely.
Oh, so you didn't get to buy drinks for everybody in the bar to celebrate, is what you're saying?
No, it was empty, apart from us.
I think you need to go back there after the ceremony now and get around for everybody. Well-deserved honor. And Colin, for you, how did you hear the news?
Yeah, I was at home and I got a phone call, and it was incredibly exciting. It's only me and my family there, but incredibly exciting. Of course, then I got on the phone to everyone else and we're comparing notes. And like Rod, I'd got to the point where I thought, after all these nominations, possibly we would never be inducted. And, you know, it was a big thrill for us to be nominated, to be absolutely honest. But when we were inducted, you know, I mean, it was beyond belief. When you think that this band originally finished in 1967, and now here we are being inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, it's a phenomenon, and it's incredibly exciting, and it's a great honour. And if I could just second what Rod said, we owe so much to you fans for voting for us, and you have to be so tenacious, because it's over a whole month you have to keep voting. It's exhausting, I know it's exhausting. But thank you so much, and it's such a thrill for us. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
And Chris, for you, what's it like being, you know, put back in the spotlight now and actually having to get ready for a trip to Brooklyn, New York, and get a tux and write a speech and everything? Are you all prepared for this?
You don't have to write a speech.
Well, if you want to.
No, it's just like it's just like 50 years have passed, you know, and we're still all friends. That's the strange thing for a 60s band. We still like each other. And we still talk to each other and work, so it is fantastic for me. And of course, the magical thing is, the day we shall be inducted, Time of the Season reached #1 50 years ago.
Yeah, that
very day.
Who'd have thought it?
That's incredible. And of course, with heavy heart, that Paul won't be there, but I'm no doubt he'll be there in spirit that night.
He will be.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And his wife Helen will be there. But yeah, I mean, we always think about Paul. When we did the Odyssey and Oracle 50th anniversary, we decided just for a year we would concentrate on that album. We went all over America with the 4 original guys and with our fantastic current band that we still love playing with all the time. And each night, at the end of the Time of the Season, a picture of Paul came up on the back of the screen, and we did dedicate, you know, the whole thing that year. We were very aware of Paul and his contribution and everything.
Right, exactly. Well, it's going to be a wonderful night. I don't think the embargo's been lifted yet, but you do know who is inducting you, right? I understand.
We do, yeah.
You do know, okay. Now, not only was there great fan support, but the industry as a whole really rallied around you guys. Colin, I remember when you and I spoke the day that the nomination was made, the news of your impending nomination was made public. You know, you mentioned quite a lot of people who have been behind you, and one in particular who you a bit sad is no longer here to celebrate with you that night.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Tom Petty has been such a supporter of the band for a long, long time. And in fact, if I remember correctly, the first rock and roll concert he ever saw was a show that we were involved in.
In Jacksonville.
Yes, and he was very taken with the whole thing, and he was describing Chris's bass. It had a tiger's tail on the end.
Still
Not
got
a
it.
real tiger's had a tiger's tail on the end of it. He remembered that first time that he saw rock and roll, and we were, I think there were 10 or 12 acts on the bill, but he remembered us specifically, and he's supported us so incredibly over the last 15 or 20 years. And of course it's a tragedy that he's gone anyway, but for us it's even a double tragedy, because it would have been lovely if he'd been involved in our induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
And we were so pleased that in the last year before he died, we actually got to know him quite well. We spent some time at his house and did some recording on he broadcast from his studio, and he came along to a couple of our concerts and everything. And you know, it was such a tragedy that he died, but I'm so pleased that we did get to know him personally a little bit before he actually went.
And again, we cannot say who will be inducting you, and even for some of you people who think that I know everything about rock and classic rock, I don't know who's inducting them, but let me just ask this. Are you pleased with this selection? Because sometimes the Rock Hall picks somebody just for popularity purposes and doesn't always gel well with the artist who's being inducted. Are you guys pleased with the decision?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes.
They're a fabulous artist, and also they have a very strong connection with the band, which I think is really important. So we're thrilled. We're absolutely thrilled.
All right. Well, we look forward to who that will be. You get to perform that night. Have they given you the marching orders on which 3 songs you'll be playing and stuff?
Yeah, I don't know if we're allowed to actually. No, we can't.
We
We
keep
can't
that
say.
under our-
Okay,
yeah.
all right.
But
We're going to be doing Please Please Me, Hard Day's Night, and Love Me Do.
I think you'll know them. I think you'll know what we're going to play.
well,
Love Me Do.
it's March 29th in Brooklyn, New York. So be fun to welcome you to my hometown. Matter of fact, 1965. You played there, Murray the K's Christmas show.
64.
64 was it? So I was all of two years old, so I didn't make it to the show. I apologize, but there was something in the air, and it made its way down to my section of town, and I knew someday I would be sharing a stage with you guys. But 7 performances a day, is that true for that Murray the K show?
It was, but
I mean, it's not a full concert, I get that.
No. Good. Shows were very different. It was just the tradition then, where you would have 15 or 16 different acts, and they would all play 1 or 2 tunes. So there were times when you walked on stage and you sang your current hit, and then you were off very quickly.
You had to dance. After each artist had to do this, after you'd been on and done your couple of songs, you had to go to the back of the stage and, do that with everybody else. It was really crazy.
That looked good, Rod.
He's been practicing for years to do that.
Well done, Rod. Well done, Rod.
But also, Hugh had to drive a motorbike, for the Shangri-Las, he had to drive a motorbike on stage. And I had the very onerous task. When they sang Give Him a Great Big Kiss, I had to go on and kiss Mary each night on stage.
Tell us that.
I didn't know that.
But it was so exhausting that there was a band on stage all the time with a full band. That sometimes one of the sax players would fall off his chair asleep.
And for you, Chris, and then you, what was it like visiting America for that first time for a bunch of kids from St. Albans in England?
Well, the weirdest thing is we're driving into New York City. We've only ever seen it on television and films. Then you hear sirens. We only had bells on our police cars. And then we heard, in Brooklyn, we sometimes heard shots at night, which we'd never heard in England. But it was a magic experience. It was like living in a TV program.
It was absolutely amazing to go to America as young people. I mean, very few people travelled anyway. So to be given the pleasure and honour of going to New York and then playing there for the first time, and being successful, I have to say, was absolutely incredible.
And Colin, didn't your mother pack some fruit for you on the journey? Didn't your mother pack some fruit for you?
Oh, yes. My parents met us at the airport and she gave me a packed lunch for the plane. But the funny thing was that she also packed in an apple. I mean, there were thousands of fans around us, and my mother fought her way through. So, here's your packed lunch for the plane. And she gave me an apple. And I hadn't eaten the apple on the plane, and you can't bring fruit into America. So the customs man, and there's thousands of people around us again, the customs man opened my bag, and he took my mother's apple out of my bag, and he ate it in front of me. I thought, I don't believe it, what's he doing? And then I realised that you couldn't bring apples. That's how I learned that you can't do it.
But then, do you remember, then he said, what are you guys doing for Christmas? And we said, well, we haven't got anything planned. He said, well, come and have lunch at our place.
Yeah, exactly.
So we did.
We did. But before that, this is the same customs guy. Now remember, he had a gun. I've never seen a gun. And I was trying to look at him, but I was looking down at this bloody gun. And he said, come, you, come with me. God, he's going to shoot me. Not only has he eaten my bloody apple, he's going to shoot me. So he took me into this little cubicle thing, and there was a phone there. And he phoned the number and he went, will you say hello to my family? So at least I wasn't shot on that occasion. I just had to say hello to his family, and then he invited us back, and we had either Christmas or New Year's Eve with his family. So it was a lovely ending. It's a frightening story.
I seem to remember he had a very pretty daughter as well.
He did. I'm not saying any more.
Did he serve apples or apple pie?
Well, I encouraged him to. I thought I'd try and get a little bit back. Yeah.
And that'd, be quite the experience, because now, today, of course, we have all this technology at our fingertips and everything, and you can plan for trips so differently. But I can imagine what that must have been like, just being thrust into that limelight, and as you said, screaming fans at the airport, all that stuff that was going on then. You?
Just to lead up to the answer to that question, in those days, of course, it was the birth of flying and aircraft travel. And my father was an aircraft engineer and would never go on an aircraft, even though he built it himself, well, part of building it. So I can't imagine what he must have thought about seeing his son going to America on an aircraft.
But it was crazy. I know that we were trapped inside the Brooklyn Fox, really, for all day long. And one day, Paul decided to go out, and he got the shirt ripped off his back, and there were people coming at him with scissors, to cut hair, just screaming everywhere. And the cops did save him, but they said that this is the last time we're going to do this. You're on your own if you do that again. So it was a crazy time.
It was a crazy time, but in many ways for me it's exactly the same. I mean, we've got all this technology now, which I don't understand at all. And I didn't understand what was happening in 1964. It was a total mystery to me. And in many ways, what happens in the music business is a mystery to me now. So I'm really lucky. Nothing's changed. It's just a big mystery. And we have a wonderful tour manager who just walks just in front of us, and I just follow her. And that's how I get from one place to another. I don't know where we are, but she does.
Does she know where we are exactly right now?
Oh yes, she's right back there.
She's right there now.
She
Mariah
led me
just
onto
wanted on the stage, yeah.
Oh, she's over there.
Big hand, please. Big hand for Mariah.
She led me onto stage.
I want to touch upon something. In all the years I've been doing artist interviews and stuff, I never asked this question of the folks from your era. There was a time when concerts in the 60s and maybe into the early 70s, no, probably not, just the 60s though, where they were literally, 20 minutes. I mean, when the Beatles played Shea Stadium, I think it was like 35, 40 minutes tops. I mean, could you imagine being one of those girls screaming your head off for 40 minutes? They leave, you go, that's it? That's what I screamed for? When was that, what was that sea change like where all of a sudden, it became an hour show or a 90-minute show or a 2-hour show? And how did you guys prepare for that? I mean, physically, just, having to sing and perform for that length of time as opposed to 20, 25 minutes.
Well, in our first incarnation, we actually split up in 1967. So it hardly got to the era when things were getting really extended. But at the same time, we were doing a lot of universities, weren't we, and colleges at the end of, and there was a change coming. But I mean, that's why the Beatles split up. They said we could never, Paul said we were losing our ability to become a good band on stage. Well, I don't believe that, because I still can't believe that in Shea Stadium, where I did Ringo's tour in 2006, and he told me that he couldn't hear a word of what was going on. He was just following the other guys' movements to see where he was. And yet, if you listen to that concert, they were all singing absolutely in tune. They still sounded great to me, and they were just coming through the PA in the sports stadium. There was no real sound for them to judge what was going on. So even at that time, that they decided to become a studio band because it was just so hard. I mean, things are just so different now. You get a great sound when you're playing on stage. You can hear everything. That's what makes it such a joy now to play all the time. And we wouldn't do it, would we, unless... when Colin and I got back together again in the early 2000s to come over to America for the first time, we'd only decided to play 6 gigs for fun. But that's what gradually turned into 19 years of playing around the world. Because, not only because the tedium of touring never gets any easier, and it gets harder as you get older. But those 2 hours or hour and a half or whatever you get on stage are fantastic buzz, and it makes you feel completely rejuvenated. It's exactly the same feeling as when you're 18 years old, and you get the energy back from the audience. It's a real privilege to be able to do that, and to play to guys like you and get all the energy back. That's why we're doing it, and without that, I don't think we would have come back on stage, would we?
No, absolutely not. It was a big surprise to us because, as Rod just said, we got together originally to play just 6 concerts, and we enjoyed it so much. It was just so incredible. I don't think we ever discussed whether we were going to go on doing more concerts. We just did it naturally. And the other thing we didn't realise was the huge interest there is in the Zombies repertoire all around the world.
Yeah.
When we first got back together again, we hardly played any zombie tunes. We played other things. And then people started saying, we want to hear more zombie songs. And so the funny thing was, we had to relearn them.
Well, we'd never played a lot of them live on stage.
We played them in the studio and never played them live. So we had to learn these. It's a little bit embarrassing, really. Rod, how does this song go? I can't remember this. I don't remember recording this song.
You never
now,
do.
we know most of them. You might spot some. When we do a concert, you might spot some where I'm going, what? What's this? They're the ones I don't remember.
Actually, it was when we heard Tom Petty on a live show doing I Want You Back Again that I said to Colin, we've never played that on stage, you know. Why don't we do it? And that's when we started doing it.
That's right, yeah.
What an absolute pleasure it was, and I would say, for both Chris and I, when the idea of trying to play Odyssey and Oracle in its entirety came about, and we very first, thank you, which in brackets, Chris and I loved doing, I've got to say, but when we very first went round your house, Rod, on your invitation, and played round the piano, it was like we'd never been away. And those songs just fell into place like you wouldn't believe.
I have to say, it was very embarrassing, actually, wasn't it? Because Colin and I said, well, I don't know, you know, Chris hasn't really played for 40 years, and, you know, we haven't played with Hugh for a long time. You know, we better have an acoustic rehearsal just to see what it sounds like. And it was so embarrassing because they were note perfect, and Colin and I were all over the place.
It's funny, I phoned up Rod and said, do you realise it's 30 years since we released Odyssey and Oracle, and my son's at university, and he says the kids really rate the album. He said, I think it might be popular. Rod turned around to your wife and said, no, it's not. He said, and when we did the premiere, which was 30 years later, was it 30? 40? 40. And it felt like we'd never stopped. It was weird. It was like being on stage with teenagers again. We still told the same old jokes, but forgot the ending. So.
And Chris, what was it like, you know, because you'd stepped away pretty early on, so what you know, I mean, you would be behind the scenes, but what was it like all of a sudden kind of being thrust once again back into that limelight, getting back on stage, dusting off the old bass, etc., etc.?
Practice. No, I was always been involved in music, producing. Rod and I produced Argent and co-wrote all the stuff, so I've been doing it ever since. I just thought Odyssey and Oracle, you know, it was just one of those things that didn't take off. And 50 years later, here it is. So I just had to practice again, you know. I had to buy a new bass.
So you talk about gigs of 30 minutes or so back in those days, and then moving into an hour or an hour and a half set. My joy was playing in local bands in England in what we might call the hiatus between early years and now, and 3 hours was nothing.
Wow.
So I was match fit.
3 sets a night, a couple of pints in between, you were ready to go.
Absolutely, you got it right.
Well, it's been quite a resurgence, and like you said, to think, you know, heck, you went your separate ways before the album even came out, and it wasn't. There was a bit of a sophomore slump, if you will, after the initial success of the first few singles, and then it kind of went down a little bit, and then you decided, okay, well, we did the first album and then the second album, but it came out, but you guys were pretty much split up by the end of the year, and then a year or two later, a buzz was generated about this album, and all of a sudden, you know, it became the legend that it is today.
Well, Chris and I were the songwriters, and we were getting very frustrated with the way recent singles, if you like, before we did Odyssey and Oracle, were sounding. They weren't coming out the way we expected, you know, and the way we imagined the songs at all. So we were based in the UK, where we'd had smaller success than almost anywhere else in the world, and so our gig money was going down. Because we had a lot of success around the world, Chris and I were getting a good income. But the other guys who just relied on live playing, I remember Paul Atkinson saying, look, I'm getting married and I haven't got any money, I'm going to have to split up. I'm going to have to leave the band. But Chris and I managed to get a deal with CBS Records to produce a set of songs in the way that we wanted them to sound. And I think everybody in the band loved doing the album, and they were really, really happy with how everything turned out. For the first time in a long time, it was how we imagined those songs. And we were knocked out. Of course, the first single came out, it got some great reviews, the album, but it didn't actually sell anywhere. So we split up. And it was, as you say, 18 months later, when time of the season, there was one guy in Boise, Idaho, that actually played this single non-stop. And there he is, he's over there, I think. Yeah. And in the way that things could in those days, it was like a stone being thrown into a pond, and the ripples started to work their way outwards. And radio stations started to pick it up, and it started shooting up the charts. And as we said earlier, on March the 29th, 1969, it became a chart-topping record for us. So by that time, Chris and I had already formed a production company. We were planning Colin's first solo album. I'd formed Argent, and we got a deal with all those things. And we didn't want to go back on the road. It felt like retracing our steps to do that at the time. And we were very excited about the path that we were all on at that point. And that's when a lot of other bands actually filled the void, if you like, and started to say that they were the Zombies. And one of those bands admitted a couple of years ago they turned out to be ZZ Top. And two guys, Dusty and also Frank.
Dusty and Frank, right?
Yeah. So it was a crazy time, wasn't it? But Hugh, didn't you have a story about one of the fake Zombies?
Yes. I think he was one of the what is now ZZ Top, but it turns out that he'd changed his name by deed poll to mine, Hugh Grundy, and he'd taken up playing the bass, and was about 6 inches shorter than me. So I don't know how he thought he'd get away with it.
I mean, one of the other things was that we tried to stop these bands playing, and there was one in particular that was getting a lot of attention. They were getting attention because they weren't very good. And we were trying to stop them, and I'd written to the Musicians Union, and I'd written to a couple of other people, and eventually they stopped. They didn't play anymore. And I thought, oh, I don't know what I did, but something's worked here. And then we found out later that a disgruntled fan had gone into the dressing room and said to them, "You are not the Zombies." And then he pulled out a gun and threatened them. And I don't blame them. They never played again. So my letter to the Musicians Union, that may have been beautifully worded. I don't think it had the slightest thing to do with it. It was the gun that did it every time.
Wow. It was the customs agent from 1964.
That's what I thought.
Was he eating an apple?
You're right, of course I hadn't thought of that.
But didn't one of the bands, Chris, or you jump in here, didn't one of the bands trademark the name?
Yes, they did.
I can tell you what that was. There was the Zombies Limited was a company that we used, and then we gave up that name, the Zombies Limited, not the Zombies, the Zombies Limited. And a manager, God, I remembered his name, Brian Gannon is an English manager, and he bought the name the Zombies Limited, which is not quite the same as the Zombies, but that's what happened.
Oh, okay, because I didn't know if you were, mired in legal wranglings for years and stuff.
No. We've got the gun. We don't need that.
Yeah, it's when Rod and I were in America after Time the Sea was a hit and we were negotiating a deal, they said, could you phone up this promoter because they're promoting somebody called the Zombies. So we spoke to them on the phone, and I said, they're not the Zombies. He said, yes they are. He said, they've not got Colin Blunstone, he got killed. Oh. I said, no, he's well alive. He said, yeah, no, that's not the story. We've got the real Zombies. Colin, are you still alive?
I'm still alive. There's a little article on the front page of Rolling Stone that said, I was killed in a car crash, and this band was set up to honour...
He's a real zombie.
I used to have that cutting, and I've lost it. I really wish I still had it.
Yeah, he's real. He's real, I promise you.
Are there photos of you walking barefoot across Abbey Road or anything that we need to know? Well, here's my cheap attempt at a segue, but Abbey Road is where you did record the bulk of Odyssey and Oracle, if not all of it. Now, that's an album that Rolling Stone is, I believe, number 100 on the list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. It gets mentioned in the same breath as Days of Future Past, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Pet Sounds. those albums, they all came out either slightly before or right around the same time. Were they an influence on your decision to go in that kind of thematic direction, if you will?
Well, not consciously, and in fact, we hadn't heard Sgt. Pepper because the Beatles were the previous band in to us, to Abbey Road, and as they were walking out, a week later we walked in to start recording Odyssey and Oracle. But I must say that I don't know if everybody else agrees with this, but Pet Sounds have been out for a while, and I think we were all felt inspired, not to copy anything that was on there, but the way that Brian had sort of extended the vocabulary of what was possible in recording. And I know from a technical point of view, with my writing, I'd always loved to have melodic bass lines that sometimes didn't relate to the root of the chord. And that was something that Brian Wilson had always done. And when I heard Pet Sounds, he took it another stage further. And that certainly made me, on my songs on Odyssey and Oracle, want to explore that melodic nature of the bass line in things like Care of Cell 44. Just about the first thing I wrote was that opening bass line phrase, etc., etc. So I think that just very, very indirectly, Pet Sounds had an influence on us by expanding that, vision of the way you could take things. I don't know if you agree with that, Chris, as the other...
Yeah, I do actually. And of course, we only had £1,000 to do the whole album, and so we had to rehearse. So we rehearsed very thoroughly before we went in there. We just did them in different 3-hour sessions. We sometimes did 1 or 2 songs in the 3 hours, because we were well rehearsed, and we had the ability to Rod suddenly found there was a mellotron there. John Lennon had left, and so we added to it, and it was very exciting. But we did it for £1,000. That was incredible.
Well, also, I think Abbey Road at the time, even now it's a wonderful studio, but Abbey Road at the time was the place to be. And we were very lucky in that we had Jeff Emmerich engineering and Peter Vince, they'd just been working on Sgt. Pepper. They were probably the best engineers in the world, and they really, really helped us. And as Chris just alluded, we were picking up percussion instruments off the floor that the Beatles had left just before us. So we were picking tambourines off the floor because they'd just been in there. And in the corner was John Lennon's mellotron, and we very naughtily just went over and used it. And if you listen to Odyssey and Oracle, there's mellotron all over it. And if John hadn't left his mellotron behind, it would have been a very different album. But we were just lucky to be in Abbey Road at that time. It was just, in the whole world, it was the place to be.
And go ahead, Chris.
So it was also very structured. It was a bit like a factory. You'd had 3-hour sessions, then they broke for lunch. People wore white or brown coats. So we were often very short for time. So on the album, we were doing a song called Changes, and it was just going over the hour. And while we were all round one microphone singing together, the crew